everyone, and welcome to my channel Needed Art History, where I am sitting telling you some art histories while, knitting occasionally at this point because it's summer and I don't like to knit in summers. But welcome to another video after another long break. I really genuinely thought that I will have a bit more time after graduation for doing my art videos, but unfortunately I'm a bit sick, so I hope it will not worry you, the sound of my voice. Even though I think it's a bit more pleasant than my real voice. But today we're going to be talking about an artist that I found out myself about, not so long ago, and I was baffled about his art and just overall about him. And I found actually a very nice book about him, a very detailed book. It's about him and his also student artist, Isaac Oliver. So today, those two, Nicholas Hilliard and Isaac Oliver, those two are going together a lot because again they were two master limners, and they were as I said, Isaac was Nicholas's student at some point, and then they became rivals after Isaac's apprenticeship with Nicholas ended. But I will not actually stop on Isaac Oliver in this video, but today we're going to be paying attention just strictly to Nicholas Hilliard, even though I will be mentioning Isaac from time to time, but again, it will not be about him, but I highly recommend you to, if you are interested in learning a bit more, I highly recommend you to look into the description. I will link down this book below as the first book, and again, very interesting, very historically rich also, so I was very happy that I found something like that. And I will not need anything today, even though I said that I don't like to knit, but I am actually knitting something like that. I have no idea what's going on here. I just bought this very strange yarn. It was on sale, so it was basically for nothing. And I was like, I need to try it. It looks extremely funny. I hope it will look great at the end, but you need to pay a lot of attention to these flowers, so I will not knit it today. I will tell you all of this story because there will be a lot of history today. And without further ado, let's dive into our topic today. Nicholas Hilliard, who lived around 1547 to 1619 or 1618, he was basically the top miniaturist in Elizabethan England. And he took the art of limning, so painting these tiny and detailed portraits, and turned it into something really refined and elegant. His work gives us a unique window, as we can say, into the royal courts of Elizabeth I and then James I as well, not just showing what people looked like, but also hinting at this political and cultural vibes, as we can say, of the time. And Hilliard had a big influence on how people in that era were visually represented, and he's remembered as a key figure now in British art. But before we'll start about Nicholas specifically, I wanted to dive very briefly into overall limning, the art of limning, how it started, where it started. So those miniature portraits painted in watercolor they were like, those tiny treasures in the world, and they still are those tiny treasures in the world of art. And what's really fascinating is that England is the only place in Europe where this tradition of portrait miniatures continued for more than 400 years, so starting from 1500s. These delicate paintings, often just few inches wide, are part of a unique artistic heritage, and back in the 16th and 17th century this form of painting was known as limning. So the word comes from the same root as illumination, that is the art of decorating medieval manuscripts, and that connection makes sense because miniature portraits actually evolved out of illuminated books, and like illuminated initials and tiny saints and prayer books, early limning were designed to be intimate, to be something personal, though those were pretty personal objects, and people would carry them in pockets or they would wear them on chains, close to their hearts, as we can say. And another also fun fact here, because miniature and illumination is my topic, I got my bachelor degree in studying all of that, and that's what actually also make this topic pretty interesting for me, because I don't know how it happened that I was not familiar with limning in Britain, and so I am kind of not ashamed, but something similar that I had no idea about that. But well, fun fact about the word miniature. I think that a lot of us are now we are associating this word with the word mini or tiny, right? But actually, it's not deriving from anything similar. The word miniature coming from the Latin word minium, actually, and minium means basically just red lead paint or red lead pigment that was used to highlight medieval texts when manuscript making became a thing. So so basically miniature means red red pigment, but this understanding and this association of miniature with mini is not something that started just during our time or even like 20th century. No, it actually started a long time ago in itself. So already in medieval times, actually like late medieval times, if I'm not mistaken. And so till now we are associating this word with something tiny, something mini, and etc. But actually it's just red paint. So but back to limning. In France, this miniature style was introduced by Jean Clouet, who was a Flemish-born artist who worked at the French court and died in 1541. And he brought with him a technique that blended elements of manuscript illumination with this visual structure of medals or coins. And still, miniature painting never fully caught on in France, where animal paintings were more in vogue. And England, however, took to limning with enthusiasm and made it a central part of its visual culture for some time. At the time, the most extravagant and influential court in Northern Europe was the Burgundian court, and their art workshops in cities like Ghent and Brugge, they were famous for their exquisite manuscript decorations. Then when Tudors came, the Tudor dynasty came to power in England in 1485, Henry VII, and even more so his son Henry VIII then, they looked to European artists to help elevate the image of the new monarchy. And as Nicholas Hilliard would later recall, that foreign artists were considered the best in painting, in sculpture, goldsmith and embroidery, and pretty much every other form of visual art. And art historian Roy Strawn argued that England's golden age of miniature painting began in the Royal Library, where many talented Flemish artists worked. And Henry VIII then brought in some of the top names from Ghent and Brugge, especially members of two families, the Bennings and the Hornbolds. So one of the biggest names of the time was Simon Bennings, who was born in 1480s in Ghent, and he was considered Europe's greatest manuscript illuminator and eventually moved to Brugge, where he then died in 1561. And his daughter, Lavina Benning, she also became a miniaturist. Then she married. And another artist, George Sterling, and he was also from Low Countries, and they then moved to England. And Lavina became a court painter, referred to as a paintrix, and while George was given a gentleman's pension at the royal court. The Hornbolt family also came from Ghent, and the father, Gerard Hornbolt, headed a major workshop and was appointed court painter to Margaret of Austria, the powerful regent of the Netherlands, starting in 1515. And his miniatures in prayer books and manuscripts were widely admired. Then his daughter, also Susanna Hornbolt, she as well was a very skilled painter, at such a point that in 1521 actually the German master Albrecht Dürer met the family in Antwerp, and he was amazed by Salvador Mundi painting that Susanna has done, and he was impressed that someone so young and also we can say the female could paint with such precision, even though as far as I remember Albrecht Dürer didn't really have any kind of prejudices toward women, because I remember reading in one of the books just overall about art history that he actually was one of the artists who were collecting women's artworks, and he was supporting quite a bit of women during his time, like women artists, and he was writing about them as well. So I think he was more surprised that someone so young as Susanna was able to do the painting like that, rather than she was a female or something like that. But well, so we don't really know the exact year the Hornbolts moved to England, but they show up in records around 1525. That year, Lucas Hornbolt, so the son, was paid 55 shillings and 6 pence, it's somewhere around £30, which was a pretty big sum, for his work at court. And their move might have been due to political instability and economic troubles in continental Europe at the time, but it could also have been helped along by their ties to the Boleyn family. So Thomas Boleyn, father of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, had diplomatic connections to Margaret of Austria's court, and his daughter Mary served there, and young Anne may have visited as well. Even though she was very young at this time, she didn't have any official position. And it was even said that the Boleyns were so committed to Lutheran ideas that people joked that they were more Lutheran than Luther himself, and while the Hornbolts may have shared similar beliefs, so their relocation likely had both financial and religious motivations. By the early 1530s, Gerard Hornbolt had either passed away or moved back to the continent, but his children, Lucas and Susanna, they both stayed in England. And well, Lucas became also a court painter and was even given a house in the parish of St. Margaret's in Westminster, likely where his studio was located as well. And it is believed that with Lucas starts the real beginning of the English miniature tradition. So a miniature portrait of Henry VIII from 1525-26, now in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, is thought to be Lucas's work, and it shows how Flemish manuscript techniques shaped the early English miniatures. The portrait is set in circular frame with a rectangle backed by a bright blue field that we will see in future works, in Nicholas Hilliard's work as well, and also it was surrounded by gold. The face is painted using a technique where translucent watercolor is layered over an opaque flesh tone base, known at the time as carnation. Then came Hans Holbein the Younger, also an extremely prominent name in history of art. He first arrived in England in 1526. By 1532, he had settled in London, living in the parish of St. Andrew's Undershaft. Unfortunately, he died of the plague in 1543 at the age only of 46. So now some art historians believe that Lucas Hornbolt actually taught him the art of limning, which helped Holbein create the famous miniatures he would later be known for. Susanna Hornbolt also stayed in England and married twice, first to John Parker, a courtier who died in the late 1530s, then to John Gilman, a court employer who managed firewood supplies. Susanna served as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves first, and later to Catherine Parr. Both were Henry VIII's wives. And she likely died before 1557. We know that because that year Gilman's will refers to his late wife Susanna. Lucas Hornbolt himself, he died actually prior to all of them in 1544, not long after Holbein's death. Lavinia Turlin, then Simon Benning's daughter, she carried on the family's legacy at court, and by the 1570s then, a young artist named Nicholas Hilliard had entered the scene. Still in his 20s, he was already highly trained and ready to make his mark in art history. In 1573, the first English book dedicated to limning was published, and it was called Limning, a Very Proper Treatise. Later, around something 1600s, Hilliard wrote his own guide, a treatise concerning the art of limning. I will link down this book below, also found it online, so you can read it, and there's also a little history there about how this treatise was written, and little research, when, how, why, and whatever. So Hilliard himself also, he had a great admiration for Holbein, calling him the finest painter and limning the most virtuous in both arts. Together with his student and fellow artist Isaac Oliver, Hilliard carried on Holbein's legacy, and they painted on incredibly fine parchment. Hilliard was particularly about using the maiden parchment taken from unborn animals and described it as needing to be smooth and white like satin. But now I think I will make it a bit easier for some of you very kind-hearted about unborn animals. So at this point now, actually, and for quite a bit, for a few decades at this point, art historians don't believe that it was actually true in any time, in any point of time, because we have this info about French manuscripts, about some of the finest French manuscripts that they were made from the skins of unborn calves, but logically speaking, that is an extremely expensive thing to do. So art historians, there were some kind of actually research done with some, mathematics there, some of the calculations, how many calves needed to be pregnant at the same time, then what they needed to do with all of the meat, with all of these little calves and everything like this. And so a lot of art historians now believe that that was something unreal even for the richest people in European courts. So so now people don't really, art historians don't really believe that that was a thing. So at first those miniature portraits were created only for royalty and nobles, well, obviously, but Hilliard himself wrote that limning was a noble service for noble people only. And as I said, it was something very, deeply personal, because we even know that Queen Elizabeth I, she stored her miniatures carefully. She was wrapping it actually in paper or in some special fabric, something like that. So she was, hiding it, and that was deeply personal thing for her. And we know that like other nobility, they had the same sentiment to those things. But eventually miniatures became popular beyond the royal court. Since Elizabeth was famously frugal, court artists often had to find some other ways to earn a living. Miniatures turned into fashion items, so women wore them on their belts or sleeves, while men wore them on chains like medallions. Even in literature we can find those mentions about limning, about those little portraits. For example, in Shakespeare's plays he reflects this trend. In The Winter's Tale, a character mentions wearing a woman's portrait, like a jewel on his neck, and in Hamlet also the prince shows his mother 2 miniature portraits of her husbands. It was a moment that would have resonated with Elizabethan audience. As Hilliard once put it, painting is an imitation of life, and true artistic excellence lies in capturing a person's face. And thanks to him and Isaac Oliver, we now have these vivid and detailed portraits of the men and women who lived at the court of Elizabeth I and James I. Their faces are preserved forever in some of the smallest yet most powerful, as we can say, works of art in British history. So now, Nicholas Hilliard and his life and family and artistic formation. So Nicholas Hilliard was born in 1547 in Exeter in Devon, and he was born to a family of and a goldsmith. His father, Richard Hilliard, he was a well-known goldsmith who even served as Exeter sheriff in 1568, and also the family was a dedicated Protestants. And so obviously growing around these precious metals and fine details, all of this clearly left an impression on young Nicholas, nurturing his skills that would later shape his work as a painter. He was one of the 4 sons in the family. 2 of his brothers, they as well became goldsmiths. However, in 1553, Mary Tudor, she became a queen, and she was the queen for 5 years, and she was a very devoted Catholic. I think that a lot of us are very familiar with Tudors and their lives, and especially if you are interested in the history of Europe. And I think that everyone who is not lazy, from historians and everything, they wrote at least one thing about Tudors. So they are already so sucked upon, I don't even know how to call it. So so I think that we kind of familiar, a lot of us are kind of familiar with this dynasty. And as I said, Mary, now she's remembered as Bloody Mary actually, and so she was a very devoted Catholic, and she started persecutions against Protestants, and that's why many of them fled the country. And so among those families were the Bodley family from Exeter as well, and they moved to Geneva via Germany, and it seemed that they brought young Nicholas with them, likely to keep him safe in their Protestant circle. And that was a strategic, even protective move during a time of religious upheaval. Richard Hilliard, meanwhile, he stayed in England, and he was busy making beautiful silverwork and stayed active in Exeter's civic life. He even took part in local defense efforts during the Catholic rebellion. And it was common actually in this time among respectable families and rich families to have their kids live with even wealthier households, and that's probably how Nicholas ended up with the Bodleys, and that was an arrangement that offered both the status and safety. In Geneva, Nicholas became close friends with Thomas Bodley, who were the future founder of the Bodleian Library at Oxford. I think also a lot of us are familiar with this library. And well, their lifelong connection was sealed in 1598 when Thomas, now restoring the library, asked Nicholas to paint his miniature portrait that was an intimate nod to their shared past and Protestant roots. And despite the value of education in Geneva, with its strong tradition of Protestant learning, the city was pretty rigid under Calvin's strict regime, and British, like English people, they were led by John Knox. For an artistically spirited kid like Nicholas living in that austere environment, all of that must have been pretty stifling. Hilliard admired Hans Holbein the Younger at this point already, who had fled parts of Switzerland because of religious conflicts himself, and Hilliard likely shared Holbein's sense that the rigid Swiss church scene wasn't great for creative expression. Yet during his time in Geneva, Nicholas still benefited, so he studied French, German, Netherlandish art and became fluent in French, and that skill would prove very invaluable when he later visited France himself as a painter at that point, court painter. He also made connections with refugee Huguenot goldsmiths, including Pierre Olivier and Olivier's son, Isaac, later known as Isaac Oliver, would become Hilliard's artistic rival right from their time together in Geneva. So Elizabeth I then came to the throne on November 17, 1558, and the following year the church settlement allowed refugees to finally return home. And Will Thomas Bodley made his way to London on September 5th of 1559, and it was, it seems that Nicholas stayed with the Bodleys there too in London. So we have it is believed earlier surviving miniatures, so those are two self-portraits of he was 13, it is believed, and a tiny likeness of Edward Seymour. And all of this is believed to be painted in London around 1560. In London also Hilliard had access to Holbein's work, both portraits and his miniatures. There is no definitive teacher credited with showing him how to paint miniatures. Unlike Holbein, Hilliard painted directly from life, following the Gainsborough miniaturist tradition, and he may have learned from several artists, perhaps including John Bates the Elder, who was connected to Holbein's circle, also Lavinia Turlin, so one of the painters that we talked about at the beginning. It is also believed that she might have taught him something, but it is pretty unclear. Richard Hilliard himself, he was very proud of Nicholas's progress in London, and he actually helped his son to become an apprentice to top goldsmiths, and Nicholas began his apprenticeship on November 13th, 1562 with John was his brother John, and they were living near Goldsmiths' Hall in Cheapside, and that row of buildings, it is said, had been a symbol of goldsmithing prestige since 1491. Nicholas's master, Robert Brandon, was the Queen's goldsmith. He ran the Gilt Lion workshop and would later become prime warden of the Goldsmiths' Company and city chamberlain. Hilliard lived with Brandon and his wife Catherine, and his wife, it was a common practice for apprenticeships, literally with their master's family, and so most of the time wives of those masters, they were caring for those kids basically. And then actually would turn out that Alice, one of the daughters of Brandon, she became Hilliard's wife and mother to his kids. Then in 1569 Nicholas became a free man of the Goldsmiths' Company and continued to expand his network. Pierre Olivier, now in London, he encouraged his son Isaac to learn limning under Hilliard's guidance, so there was a clear link between the two miniaturists. By the early 1570s, Hilliard had graduated from apprentice to extraordinary artist. He was a limner, he was a goldsmith, he was a jeweler, calligrapher, and possibly even an engraver. And his first miniatures as an adult, painted in 1571, possibly showing Oliver St. John, reveal a pretty high level of skill already. In 1572, he painted the striking portrait Unknown Man, aged 24, clearly influenced by Flemish painter Antonio More's portrait of Sir Henry Lee. In the early works, Hilliard began embedding symbolism, so colors, inscriptions, different jewelries, some kind of personal messages. And for example, in the portrait of 1572, we can see some features like green ribbons, for example, that can be translated as some kind of love symbol, something like that, of life. Then also black clothes, this can mean something like constancy or something like this, but still, all of these things, all of these little details likely meant to communicate a private meaning to someone. Hilliard also preferred demanding techniques like laying down a vivid blue background with layers of azurite and watercolor in wet strokes, and exacting visual style tied to literacy in manuscript illumination. So what is this technique about? How was it done? So having outlined the contour of the figure with a fine brush and a watery mixture of blue, the master then swept the same mixture over the whole background area with a larger brush, and finally, while this was still wet, a thicker mixture was applied with a third brush, achieving this smooth and brilliant finish. And this period marked Hilliard's emergence as a master of a uniquely English miniature style, both technically and also symbolically rich. And after completing his apprenticeship, Nicholas Hilliard likely began working at Elizabeth I's court immediately. Some actually believe that even before finishing, well, not long before finishing his apprenticeship. The landmark miniature of Elizabeth intertwined a refined technique with rich symbolism, white rose of purity, painted gems so realistic that they actually fooled some of the viewers. However, sometimes he was putting actually real jewelry into the paintings. For example, he set one time real diamonds into painted crosses and developed advanced method to apply transparent pigments and metal powders with a heated point, a clear innovation rooted in his goldsmith training, and also, as it is believed, it is Holbein's influence. Hilliard pioneered using actual gold and silver powders in his miniatures, so stirring them with gum arabic, burnishing with tiny teeth, painting pearls with raised white and silver, techniques dating back centuries but refined by him into something dazzling at this point. He also believed that line was more important than shadow in miniatures intended for close viewing, because fine outlines capture likeness more than tonal modeling does. And in a revealing anecdote, Hilliard recalls his first sitting with Queen Elizabeth, where she impressed him by discussing differences in shadowing across national styles in Europe, and she noted that Italians considered great artists and they often avoided shadowing. And the Queen agreed with Hilliard's reasoning: to show oneself best needs no shadow but open light. And as a result, she chose to be painted in full sunlight in a garden with no trees, possibly somewhere in one of her courts. Hilliard described also the scene that he sat about 2 yards away, carefully matching the Queen's eye level, and this early encounter not only validated his stylistic approach but also highlighted Elizabeth's sharp mind and her artistic insight as well. And he respectfully concluded that her thoughtful questions greatly improved his own artistic judgment. So praise from Sir John Harrington in 1591 confirmed Hilliard's reputation. He could capture Queen Elizabeth in 4 masterful lines. His treatise underlined the same principle: a good line again can speak volumes. Another also thing is, while Hilliard respected Dürer's mathematical proportions, he felt that painting, especially limning, required flexibility and subtle illusion, not rigid geometry. And in his day, limning was the highest form of painting reserved for the nobility, and limners belonged to goldsmiths' company, while panel painters were in the subordinate guild actually. Hilliard openly embraced this hierarchy. Limning was a refined art form suited to gentlemen, so gentle, independent, observant, and etc. Though he acknowledged talent could override class, so some noblemen lack spirit, while others of humble birth have the gift. But still, he maintained that social standing helped cultivate artistic success, which I think it's kind of true still. So his manuscript treatise, now preserved in Edinburgh, includes funny and revealing asides, like his annoyance with sitters who interrupt or argue prematurely, urging artists to remain calm and patient, even though he probably didn't follow himself his own advices, because as we understand, he was he was an artist. That's everything that needs to be said. But Hilliard's most passionate complaints in the treatise concerned the lack of proper rewards for artists in England. So he praised Henry VIII for supporting foreign artists, but he pointed out that most English painters, they actually struggled without side jobs or royal pensions. In contrast, artists abroad are frequently wealthy thanks to more generous patronage. He criticized a culture that undervalue skill, noting that fast-working but less talented butchers, as he was saying, can quickly produce multiple works, gaining favor simply by meeting deadlines. Meanwhile, excellent workmen who put time and care into their art, they earn less and are often discouraged. So this timeless issue, I think, quality versus speed, it still resonates with us and with, well, artists especially today. And I think a lot of you, especially if you are an artist, you will agree with that it is a very big problem nowadays with all of this artificial intelligence, with AI. It is especially a big problem now. Hilliard also hints that at the height cost of materials, again, a burden often overlooked still even today. So he mentions, for example, ultramarine of Venice. That was the finest and darkest blue used in limning, which costed him as much as 3 shillings and 8 pence per carat. So it is equivalent to over £11 per ounce, and that was an extremely enormously big sum for a pigment. Because even he was saying that even the cheapest one, also worst one, they still costed him a bit more than £7 per ounce. And so you will understand right now why it is so extremely expensive. But despite his fame and his royal connections, Nicholas Hilliard's complaints about poor financial reward for artists, they were entirely justified, I believe, because though he received patronage from the nobility and from the crown, it brought prestige more than money to him. Unlike Lavinia Turling, for example, who enjoyed a £40 unial crown annuity for 30 years, Hilliard actually had no regular income until 1599. So that is like nearly 3 decades into his career. Let alone even this annual payment from the crown, it was not up until to his lifetime. So he received this for a few years. Then again he was stripped away from that, and I mean we will talk about this later at the end of the video. So he didn't really have any income, steady income. Occasional payments, when they came, they were pretty modest. So records show that he was paid £3. That was a very typical fee for one of his miniatures, £3. And I remind you that one Venice blue costed him £11. So, and well, though £3 was not insignificant, it was certainly not generous at all as well for such an amount of work and such amazing work. And one such £3 miniature painted in 1574 was of Jane Buckton. This portrait remained in her family for centuries and eventually was sold at Sotheby's in 1980 for £75,000, setting a record for a portrait miniature at the time and showing artistic value but not economic stability in Hilliard's time. Despite hints of a grand start, the biographical record shows a more complicated story. So Hilliard rose to prominence quickly, married into a prestigious family and painted for nobles, and yet financial insecurity dogged him. Promised leases and sums weren't always delivered. A privy seal warrant, for example, in 1573 for £100 may never have paid out. Another in 1591 promised £400. However, 8 years after that, 8 years later, he was writing a letter to someone, don't remember who, but he was writing a letter and saying that at that point, after 8 years, he just received 40 pounds. So pretty strange situation, right? Even the £40 still, it was quite a big sum back in time, but still 440, it's a big difference. Then in mid-70s, he started to take, the beginning of 70s, yes, something there. He started to take apprenticeship students, better word, his students himself. So we know their names at this point, so I mean, I will not, there were pretty a lot of them, so I will not just go and name all of them. Is that just he became a teacher himself, and he took some of the apprenticeships himself, and so he was training them through 1572 to 75, and then in 1576 he traveled to France for a few years. So fast forward to 1576, as I said. On July 15th he married Alice Brandon in church near Goldsmiths Hall. She was only 20 at the time, and not long after the wedding, the newlyweds, they set off on a bold journey to France. So Hilliard, always ambitious and eager to hone his craft, was following the advice he'd later write in his treatise that any aspiring artist, they should travel and they should learn from other wise people, from wise artists also. By the late 1576, he likely joined Sir Amias Paulet, the new English ambassador to France, as part of his official entourage. So Paulet, a seasoned and reliable servant of Queen Elizabeth I, would later be entrusted with guarding Mary, Queen of Scots, and his embassy from 1576 to 1579 came at a tense time diplomatically. So they arrived in Calais on 25th of September 1576, and among the group was the youngest and brilliant Francis Bacon, who at this point was fresh out of Cambridge, and very likely Nicholas and Alice Hilliard. In fact, a letter from Paulet in December mentions his great train of Queen-approved gentlemen, including a Mr. Hilliard, something like that. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that in English, but that is how that was a reference to Hilliard. This is how he was mentioned in those court documents like this. So this confirms that Hilliard wasn't freelancing. He was in France with the Queen's blessing and for an important reason. So the main reason for Hilliard's trip was probably to paint portraits of François, Duc d'Alençon, who was Catherine de Medici's third son, and Elizabeth was interested in him because of ongoing marriage negotiations. François, as it was said, was not exactly a handsome match, so he was short, he was also he had a big nose, his face was marked by smallpox, but it was said that he was smart, he was lively and charming, and those are qualities that likely appealed to Elizabeth's sharp mind. Before this, Elizabeth had been courted by his brothers, his older brothers, Henry III and the Duc d'Anjou, but those talks didn't work out. The Treaty of Blois in 1572 aligned England and France, but the royal marriage idea lingered, uncertain but still alive. So Hilliard's role in France wasn't just about art, it was part of important political moves and royal matchmaking, showing how much, again, trust Elizabeth put in Hilliard. In 1577, he was officially on Alençon's payroll as Nicolas Bellart, English painter and chamber attendant to the Duke of Alençon, and he was owning 20 livres per year. One of his more personal creations was decorating a tiny prayer book owned by Queen Elizabeth, in which she handwritten prayers in 6 languages, and Hilliard's miniature of Alençon opened the book, and portrait of Elizabeth was at the end of the book, so closed the book. And though the original was, it has been lost at the point, but we have a black and white reproduction, black and white facsimile that is survived in British Library. And Elizabeth evidently liked what she saw. Hilliard's depiction didn't hurt Alençon's chances. If anything, they sparked new waves of courtship, and in January 1579, Alençon sent Jean de Simier, who was his charming and flamboyant envoy, to woo Elizabeth further. Simier quickly became a favorite at court, so Elizabeth nicknamed him actually Monkey, and he signed his letter to her as "Your poor monkey." However, the ambassador Paulet was less amused by him. He complained that dealing with Simier was like being tortured by 1,000 questions. By August then 1579, Alençon himself arrived in England, and Elizabeth gave him the nickname Petit Grenouille, so little frog. There was a mix of endearment and irony in that. And Hilliard likely resumed his role during this visit, sketching the Duke and playing a discreet part in the Queen's last serious flirtation with marriage. But the match was never meant to be. As we know now, Elizabeth at this point was 46, was no heir, and opposition was mounting. So Alençon returned again in winter 1581-82, but interest at this point had cooled. And when he left in February 1582, Elizabeth accompanied him as far as Canterbury and even showed off her ships in Rochester. Then some of her noblemen, they accompanied Alençon a bit further. One of them actually got to France with him. So yeah, and that's how everything is ended. And just in 2 years, Alençon died. But while in France, Hilliard's fluency in French that he earned in Geneva proved invaluable. So he blended easily into court life and made powerful friends. He likely visited the glittering court of Navarre through Alençon's sister Marguerite, the Queen of Navarre. And in summer of 1577, the English embassy travelled as far as Poitiers, and Hilliard probably went with them as well. Around that time, he may have met Jacques Goultier, a notable artist who became then official painter of Bordeaux, and well, Hilliard made a strong impression on the French art world, and in the letter from 1592 or 1593, Gautier sent him some paint and asked for more in return, respectfully addressing him as Monsieur Hilliard, painter and goldsmith to the Queen, so very high praise. He also befriended Blaise de Vigenère, who was a philosopher and secretary to the Duc de Nevers, and Vigenère admired Hilliard's deeply and hoped he'd be commissioned to paint a book of portraits of Europe's great figures. However, we have no idea whether this project was started ever or not, but Hilliard did engrave woodcut portraits of the Duc de Nevers and his wife for a charitable publication. But life in France wasn't all glamour, so in early 1578, Vigenère wrote that Hilliard had disappeared. So he'd been staying with the famous sculptor and goldsmith Germain Pilot, then was found hiding in a home of George of Ghent, painter Queen Mother Catherine de Medici, likely avoiding creditors at this point, so there was some kind of interesting moment. At the same time, Paulet wrote to Walsingham that Hilliard had no plans to abandon Elizabeth's service. He was simply there to grow, or artistically grow, obviously, to learn and ideally to make a bit of money. And that letter reveals something key. Despite his talent, Hilliard hadn't found steady financial footing before his trip. But time was pressing, and Alice at this point was heavily pregnant, and they wanted to go home already. And then we know that their son Daniel was baptized in London on 16th of May of 1578 at St. Vedas Foster Lane, so that was the same church where Hilliard and Alice married. Yet by mid-June, Hilliard was still in France, and how we know this? Because in a letter dated of 16th of June 1578, Paulet wrote that Hilliard was sick but promised to finish a jewel for the Earl of Hertford within 3 weeks, and he probably sent it rather than delivered it in person then. But during this time abroad, so during those last months of pregnancy of Alice, so Hilliard's father Richard, he actually came to France to them. So we know about one of the self-portraits and a miniature of his father, both dated now to 1577. He also painted, Hilliard also painted a third portrait of an unknown man, age 52, wearing black with a tall hat, perhaps someone they met in court. And so it is believed that probably his father was the one who escorted Alice back to London before the birth. And also one of the most beautiful miniatures Hilliard has ever painted is the portrait of Alice that is dated to 1578, and now it is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. So he probably and most definitely he painted this miniature before Alice left, because childbirth was still a very dangerous thing, and crossing the channel even more so was dangerous, so he wouldn't have waited to paint her back in London. So the influence of French art in his artworks was pretty clear. In his treatise, Hilliard mentions learning from great artists from Italy, from France and the Low Countries, including Rosso, probably Giambattista Rossi, linked to the Fontainebleau school. Art historian Roy Strong believes that Hilliard's iconic young man among roses, this miniature shows the influence of Fontainebleau school also. And while in France, Hilliard's miniatures were round, like Holbein's, but in his portrait of Alice, this portrait was done in oval, as was his first Elizabeth miniature from 1572. After returning, then Hilliard generally favored oval formats, though sometimes he would switch back to the round ones. For example, for his portrait of 1581 of Francis Drake, he used a round frame there, which suited Drake's sturdy build and famously round head. By August of 1578, Hilliard was still abroad. And again, how we know this? Because his apprentice William Frank had to delay joining the goldsmiths' company because his master was at this present beyond the seas. and Frank finally became free in November, likely right after Hilliard returned. So Hilliard would later recall being abroad for 2 years, and it's fitting with the departure in late 1576 and returning in autumn in November of 1578. Also interesting thing is that Francis Bacon, he stayed in France through early 1578. He was very young, just 18 at this point, and so Hilliard painted his portrait this year. And so, well, that's how they knew one another basically for all their life. And so, jumping forward 40 years, Bacon was now Lord Chancellor and Hilliard was in his final months. And in 1618, there was a payment of £11 that was made to old Mr. Hilliard from Bacon's household. And that was one of the largest personal gifts recorded. And at this point, art historians who were studying Hilliard, they believed that it was not a commissioned work. It may have been just a gesture of gratitude to Hilliard. And it's kind of a comforting thought, as we can say, that one of England's greatest thinkers, honouring one of its greatest painters, helping support Hilliard's faithful servant Elizabeth Deacon during his last illnesses. Nicholas Hilliard finally came back to London in October or around November of 1578 and met his baby son for the first time, Daniel. He'd been in France trying to get financial support from the nobility, but again he had no luck. A year later, on October 4th, 1579, his second child, Elizabeth, was baptized at St. Vitus-Forster-Lane as well. And soon after returning, Hilliard borrowed actually £70 from his father-in-law, Brendan, but under very tough condition that the loan was secured against a property in St. George Parish, Exeter, which Hilliard's father had sold to Brendan. The money had to be repaid then exactly 1 year later on May Day of 1580 at Brendan's house in West Cheap. By then, Hilliard was officially a London citizen and goldsmith, and he's later grumbled in his treatise about the unfair reputation that skilled men are always careless with money, probably reflects frustration with his wealthy father-in-law. And it showed the poor financial situation. Around 1579-80, Hilliard seems to have developed gout. In a 1610 letter to Lord Salisbury, he described a horrible illness that lasted 40 days and had bothered him for 30 years, probably a form called flying gout, where the pain moves around the body. And despite the illness, his hand stayed steady and he kept painting at a high level almost to the end of his life. Next, in 1579, his family moved into a new home, and this house was owned by the Goldsmiths Company, and Hilliard had actually been promised the lease back in 1573, but only once the current tenant, another goldsmith named Nicholas Johnson, passed away. And we don't know when exactly Johnson died, but by the time the Hilliards moved in, the house was there to fully occupy. And what was very important is that it had windows facing northeast. That is exactly the kind of light that Hilliard needed for his detailed painting works, and what he was writing in treatise, that this is the light that is needed. Around the time then Oliver joined Hilliard's household in Gutter Lane, and Hilliard's third child, a boy named Francis, was born and baptized in 1580. And interestingly also, it is believed that Francis Drake was his godfather, because when he returned from his famous round-the-world voyage, because they were both from Devon, and it is believed that they actually knew one another for quite a while at this point, and they were likely friends, we can say, or at least very good acquaintances. In 1581 then, Hilliard painted 2 miniatures of Drake to celebrate his knighthood at Deptford. Instead of portraying him in armour, Hilliard painted him as this fashionable courtier. In one of the portraits, an oval miniature is now in Vienna, and the smaller round one is in London's National Portrait Gallery. On 5th of March 1581-82, Hilliard's third son, then Lawrence, was baptized at St. Vitus-Forster-Lane as well, and Lawrence outlived his father and took over as a royal limner himself later in life. In 1582 then, Hilliard's father-in-law, Robert Brendan, became both master of the Goldsmiths Company and Chamberlain of London, but still didn't help Hilliard financially at all. But then some of the Hilliard's acquaintances, some of the noblemen from Elizabeth Court, they wrote some letters and everything, and they tried to help Nicholas a bit, and they helped him a bit. but still Nicholas was in a pretty bad financial situation. And just overall through his lifetime, he was constantly getting involved into some massive financial deals, and there was deals in, he was supporting those noble people, so that was probably something that he, those were people that he believed too or something, I don't know, but that would be a constant occurrence in his lifetime, those pretty shady financial stuff going on, and he would never win in them. He would never get anything out of that, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know. But well, so there was even this situation in 1583 that when Hilliard spoke to Hudson, so Hudson, he was it was Lord Hudson, he was Queen Elizabeth's first cousin. Some historians even believe that he possibly could have been her half brother, because Hudson's mother has been a mistress of Henry the Eighth before her sister married the king. So Hilliard asked Lord Hudson to help a man named Francis Brigham to get a job as a royal falconer. That was a pretty prestigious role in charge of the Queen's hunting birds. And Francis' brother Thomas Brigham had asked Hilliard to help. Hilliard successfully got Francis the job, which came with a wage of 12 pence for a year or something like this, for life. Or overall, that was a pretty good sum back in time. And later, Hilliard claimed that that Thomas had promised to pay him £40 in return for that help. However, Thomas denied making any such deals with Hilliard and said that he needed money for something more important. And well, this dispute led to both men taking each other to court, but at this point we don't really know how the case ended for both of them. And then in 1584, Hilliard gave Queen Elizabeth a New Year's gift, a panel painting showing the biblical story of the 5 wise and 5 foolish virgins, and it was meant to praise her wisdom and virtue. The Queen didn't give him a gift in return, which suggested that Hilliard was trying to secure his job as royal limner rather than expecting a reward. Around that same time, another artist, George Gowell, was granted a draft patent that gave him a monopoly on painting the Queen, but except for Hilliard, so he was still allowed to paint her in small miniatures. So this shows, again, Hilliard had special permission to continue his work, which may have come with some, informal privileges. Hilliard's talent also got him a major government job. He designed the second Great Seal of England, so that is the seal that was used for the official documents. And that was done because the first one was already worn out, and Hilliard designed it, and the engraving was done by Derek Anthony, another skilled goldsmith whose family had originally come from Germany. Both Anthony and Hilliard's father-in-law lived in the same parish in London, so they likely also knew each other. Despite these accomplishments, Hilliard kept getting into money troubles. In 1599, he asked the Privy Council if he could borrow 100 or 200 pounds from the orphanage funds, promising solid security, though considering his financial history, that was pretty unrealistic. And in the petition, he mentioned work of the Great Seal, but he was referring to a third version that was actually never used, simply because Queen didn't like it. So that petition was dated May 1599, and just a month later he wrote to Sir Robert Cecil, admitting that he was in great extremes financially. Robert Brandon's, so his father-in-law, will strongly suggests that he didn't believe that his daughter Alice was being properly supported by her husband. Even more telling, Brandon completely ignored Alice and Nicholas's children in his will, and some people have suggested that Brandon arranged for Alice those £50 inheritance to go through the goldsmith's company, so it wouldn't fall into hands of Nicholas's creditors. And that may be true, but it still does not really explain why he left out his grandchildren altogether. A few years later, Nicholas Hilliard's own father, Richard Hilliard, died, and his will was proven in 1594, and in it he left Nicholas a few meaningful things: some property in Exeter, the right to choose the priest for the local parish church, it is known as the patronage, his best gown, and a gold ring with the carnelian stone. So then some of the stuff also was given to other children of Richard's children, but everything else was left to Richard's wife Lawrence, who was named as his executor. Many people writing about Nicholas Hilliard highlight that he had a pretty charming persona, which comes across in his portraits and letters to Robert Cecil, but to survive as an artist in the rough and competitive world of Elizabeth in London, especially while often being short on money, he must also have been incredibly determined and resilient. So he worked under difficult conditions in the noisy and crowded city, though things would have been more comfortable when he worked at court in noble households. That said, other sources suggest Hilliard could be pretty proud of himself, difficult and self-centered, well, a typical, as we can say, temperamental artist. But was Nicholas Hilliard a good husband and father? That was also the thing that is asked about him. And based on Robert Brandon will, the answer may be no. And even more curiously, there is very little information about Hilliard's 7 children. In Hilliard's own will, made in 1618, he only mentions his son Lawrence, who had also become a miniaturist, and we do know that Hilliard's daughter Elizabeth married a man named Thomas Richardson in the late 1590s, and they had a daughter also named Elizabeth. However, the marriage did not take place at their parish church St. Vedas, which might suggest that the Hilliard family was no longer living in their long-time home about the shop called the Maidenhead on Gutter Lane. What's also strange is that none of Hilliard's children were buried at St. Vedas either, which again raises questions about what happened to them. There's also some mystery surrounding Hilliard's wife, or possibly wives, because he portrayed a miniature of Alice painted in 1578 there in France, was later inscribed with the Latin word meaning first wife, which implies that they may have been a second one. So some assume that he did remarry in 1608 to a woman named Susan Guyard, based on a record from the Church of St. Mary at Hill near London Bridge, but that is uncertain because there was another Nicholas Hilliard that was living in this area in the 1620s, and he may have been the one who got married. One possible clue, a woman named Alice Hilliard was buried at St. Margaret's, Westminster on 16th of May, 1611. And if that was Hilliard's first wife, then, well, she actually died after the 1608 remarriage, making the timeline very confusing and pretty unreal. But what we do know for certain is that by the time that Hilliard himself died, he did not mention any wife or wives in his will. He only left things to his son Lawrence, his sister Anne Avery, and his loyal servant Elizabeth Deacon, who had taken care of him during his final illnesses. So again, where are the other children? So even if he had a wife, the second wife, she probably died also like before him, and she didn't really had a really important place in his life, as we can say. But well, in 1598, Dr. Richard Haydock, he published his English translation of the first 5 books of Giovanni Paolo Lamazza's treatise about art, that was originally published in Milan in 1584. And in his introduction to this treatise, to this book, to this translation, Haydock praised the famous English miniaturist Nicholas Hilliard, comparing him to Raphael and calling his work extraordinary. So he claimed that the best way to explain Hilliard's unique style was to get the artist to write about it himself, well, which apparently Hilliard agreed to do. So according to Haydock, we owe the existence of Hilliard's treatise to his encouragement. This all happened the same year Thomas Bodley, Hilliard's old friend that we mentioned from the beginning, began planning his famous Bodleian library at Oxford. And interestingly, Haydock dedicated his translation to Bodley, and since Haydock was a fellow at New College, it is likely that Bodley connected him with Hilliard. So Bodley may have had a hand in inspiring the treatise too. And despite being busy, Hilliard did manage to write, or at least draft, the treatise. It had to be done before Queen Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603, and well, so it is believed that he wrote his treatise around 1600s. And like he wrote and completed it that year. And Hilliard also was, well, it is clear that he was familiar with Haydock's translation of Lamazza. He even begins his treatise by saying that he won't repeat what Lamazza and others have already covered about painting in general. Instead, he said that he would focus strictly on limning, even though sometimes he would get away from the topic, but still. Then, after King James took the throne in 1603, Nicholas Hilliard, he still stayed in royal favour. An 18th century writer than George Virtue said that Hilliard was in great favour at court, though his student Isaac Oliver ended up more celebrated across Europe. As the official royal limner, Hilliard made lots of portraits around the time of James' accession. For instance, when the Earl of Rutland came back from Denmark, he'd attended a royal christening on the king's behalf. He and other courtiers, they received portraits those portraits or medals, something like this, that was probably made by Hilliard. At the same time, Hilliard was worried about his son Lawrence, and in 1601 he wrote to Robert Cecil asking if Lawrence, who was talented and spoke Spanish, could join Cecil's household. Hilliard could not afford to train him properly. And then Lawrence later became a free man of the Goldsmiths Company in 1605 and worked alongside his father on royal commissions. In 1606, Hilliard asked again for his small royal pension of £40 to be raised, but nothing came of it, and in fact he hadn't even been receiving the £40 in 1602. And after a legal battle, the Court of Requests ruled in 1610 that it should be restored, and payments resumed in 1611, and the last record of it is in March 1618. He did get some one-off payments for royal artworks, so miniatures, medals, and portraits for foreign dignitaries, worth about £136 between the years of 1603 to 1612, but he was often promised more, and those promises usually didn't come through. So that happened during Elizabeth ruling too. His successor, though, Samuel Cooper, for example, had much better luck. He made a fortune from miniatures, so he would sometimes receive those £40 per miniature from the noble people, and none of these noblemen were complaining about such a high prices. They were paying, and that was the thing that while Hilliard during his lifetime, he often struggled because of that, and he was not paid enough for such detailed and refined work. Later in life, Hilliard again got involved in a strange side project with another goldsmith, William Labourer, to improve England's roads. And Labourer had a shady record actually, because he was accused of abusing apprentices and forging silver, but Hilliard still backed him, claiming that goldsmiths could help beautify the highways. However, later he admitted that he'd been hoping to profit obviously from this scheme for years, but again, unfortunately nothing came out of that. During the last years of his life, he got some of the payments. We have records of these official payments, and those were not big sums, as we can say. Well, there were big sums again, but not so big for such work. So there was a payment for £12, for example, then of £8. The biggest one was actually in 1615 of £35. Then again, he had some kind of work done for £4 and something like this. But one of very big payment came after Hilliard's death, and that was £104 private payment, and this payment was already made to Lawrence, because again Hilliard died at this point, and those were payments for works done by Nicholas before he died. Then another thing also. So in 1613, Nicholas Hilliard's name popped up in a Catholic-related scandal. So a man named Abraham Savory had been distributing Catholic books. That was considered a serious offence, and the portrait Hilliard had painted of him ended up in Brussels, admired at the Archduke's court. The portrait wasn't illegal, and Hilliard wasn't in trouble for that, but it shows how his work often ended up in politically sensitive situations. Something similar happened to him already in 1590s also. Nicholas Hilliard kept working right up to the end of his life, and though people often say, some of the historians believe that he died somewhere around 7th of January of 1618, but it is believed that that was the date of burial. So he died somewhere around 3rd or 4th January of 1619, because we know that he wrote a will on 24th of December of 1618. But at this point he was so ill that he was not able to sign it even, so he would just put some mark on that. And so Lawrence, he buried his father. He was not able to put something very lavish for him, because again they didn't really have money for that, but still he had a pretty expensive funeral. So Nicholas Hilliard's profound impact on English art is undeniable at this point. So he was the first notable English portrait miniature artist credited with creating some of the greatest artworks produced in the British Isles. So his pioneering of limning and his elevation of miniature painting to this new artistic heights established Britain as the center of this art form for centuries. Hilliard's treatise concerning the art of limning, again as we mentioned, that was done around 1600s, stands as a foundational text providing invaluable insights into the techniques and philosophy of miniature painting, emphasizing also patience, precision, and the unique ability of miniatures to capture a sitter's true likeness. Though not widely circulated in his lifetime, its principles influenced future generations of artists. Hilliard's workshop was instrumental in training future miniaturists, most notably his own son Lawrence Hilliard, who continued the family business then after his death, and his most significant pupil Isaac Oliver eventually surpassed him in court favour during the Jacobean era, but Oliver's own mastery was built upon the foundations laid by Hilliard. The stylistic evolution from Hilliard's linear, shadow-avoiding approach to Oliver's more continental, volumetric style marks a significant transition in English miniature painting, yet both artists together defined the genre of their time. So Hilliard's enduring legacy extends beyond artistic technique. His role as the trusted creator of Queen Elizabeth I's iconic image profoundly shaped her public persona, crafting a carefully constructed image that blended realism with idealism and perpetuated the myth of the Virgin Queen. His miniatures, often worn as tokens of loyalty, became powerful tools for demonstrating favor, showcasing alliance, and expressing personal relationship within the politically charged Elizabethan court. Even under James I, Hilliard's work continued to be valued, with the king commissioning portrait of his family and utilizing miniatures for diplomatic purposes. Hilliard's ability to navigate the transition between monarchs, adapting his style while maintaining his artistic integrity, ensured his lasting impact as a leading portraitist of English Renaissance. And so his works remain highly admired and are held in prestigious collections worldwide, including the Royal Collection, the National Portrait Gallery, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and etc. etc. So yeah, so this is everything that I have about Nicholas Hilliard and his life and his art, and just overall about such an interesting thing as limning that I again never heard of myself. And I hope that you found this video interesting. I hope that I did not put too much information here. I don't know, because again, that book that I used mostly, amazing stuff, extremely rich in dates, in people, in all of this different events and stuff like that. So I hope that I was able to make this pretty clear about him. And well, I hope that you found something new for yourself today, the most important thing for me here. And so yeah, stay healthy, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next videos. Bye bye.